There is a cartridge the American firearms industry built to win, and then killed in 18 months. It was not a failure. It outshot every Magnum its size. It flew flatter, hit harder, and carried farther than the round that made Smith & Wesson a household name. The men who designed it knew exactly what they were holding. And the same industry that sold it spent the next 2 years pretending it had never worked at all. The cartridge was called the .357 Maximum. To understand what was lost, start with the number that started everything. In 1983, Remington and Ruger took the familiar .357 Magnum case and stretched it 0.3 of an inch longer. That small change did something large. The standard .357 Magnum runs at roughly 35,000 psi. The new Maximum was rated at 40,000. The extra room held more slow-burning powder, and that powder pushed a heavy bullet to a speed a revolver had no honest business reaching. A 180-grain bullet could leave a long barrel near 1,530 feet per second. Lighter bullets crossed 1,800. Those are not pistol numbers. That is rifle country. Think about what that meant for a moment. A man could hold in one hand a revolver throwing energy that, until then, had demanded a rifle and a shoulder stock. And the same cylinder would still chamber the cheap .38 Special already sitting in his box, the way every .357 before it always had. The most powerful production revolver cartridge of its kind had just arrived. It would be gone before most of the country ever knew it existed. The idea did not come from a boardroom. It came from a hunter. Elgin Gates was an American big game hunter, an author, and the founding president of the International Handgun Metallic Silhouette Association. If that title sounds obscure, the sport behind it is simple and brutal. A shooter stands at a line and tries to knock heavy steel animal targets clean off their stands with a handgun, and the farthest of them, the rams, sit 200 meters away and weigh some 60 pounds of solid steel. That sport asks a very specific thing of a cartridge. It is not enough to be fast. The bullet has to arrive heavy. A light, fast projectile can smack a steel ram and merely ring it. A heavy one carries the momentum to tip it over. Knockdown is a question of mass still moving when it arrives, not of the number printed on the box. And that single piece of physics is the key to everything that happened next. Gates understood it cold. He looked at the Magnums of his era and decided that longer would be better. Through the 1970s, he developed a family of stretched cartridges he named the SuperMags, all of them the same length, all of them built around one principle. Heavy bullets, slow powder, velocity earned through case capacity, not stolen by chasing the lightest projectile on the shelf. And the timing was no accident. Handgun silhouette shooting was exploding across America in the late 1970s and early 80s, pulling in thousands of shooters who suddenly needed a revolver that could reach 200 meters and still arrive with authority. Gates had built his cartridge for exactly that wave. When Remington and Ruger brought it to market in 1983, it was answering a real and rising demand, not inventing one out of thin air. The .357 SuperMag was the first of the line. When Remington and Ruger put it into production, they renamed it the .357 Maximum and chambered it in a new model Blackhawk built on a longer frame and cylinder to swallow the taller round. For the silhouette shooters who understood exactly what it was for, it was very nearly a perfect instrument. That is the detail this whole story turns on. The Maximum was never designed to be the fastest thing on the shelf. It was designed to send a heavy bullet downrange with rifle-like authority, and to do it without burning itself up. Run the way its maker intended, it did precisely that. Step away from the steel rams for a moment and put the cartridge in a hunter's hand, because that is where its real promise lived. For generations, a man who wanted to take a deer cleanly carried a rifle. The handgun was a sidearm, a finisher, a thing of close work and modest range. The .357 Maximum quietly moved that line. From a long barrel, with a heavy bullet, it landed in the same honest neighborhood as the .35 Remington, a cartridge people had carried into deer woods since before the First World War. And what actually puts game down is no mystery, whatever the magazines of the 70s wanted you to believe. It is not shock waves or speed. It is a bullet heavy enough and built well enough to drive through muscle and bone and reach the vitals, every time, from whatever angle the animal gives you. That is exactly what a heavy bullet at maximum velocity does. It penetrates with authority and holds together getting there. So the cartridge handed the handgun hunters something genuinely rare. A wheel gun that could ethically reach deer-sized game at distances a revolver had never honestly owned, using the kind of heavy, deep-driving bullet a serious hunter wanted in the first place. The irony writes itself. The light, fast factory loads that would later be blamed for killing the cartridge were the opposite of what any hunter or silhouette shooter ever asked it to throw. Handgun hunting has always been a discipline of restraint. A man who chooses a revolver over a rifle is accepting a harder shot, a closer stalk, a thinner margin for error, trading easy reach for the older satisfaction of doing more with less. The Maximum fit that creed exactly. It did not make the work easy. It made the hard, honest version of the work possible, in the hands of someone willing to learn the cartridge and respect what it asked of him. That is the kind of tool that earns loyalty instead of buying it. The shooters who carried it into the field never needed a magazine to tell them what it was worth. They knew, because they had walked it up a ridge at first light and brought home exactly what they had aimed at. The people who used it for what it was built for understood all of this. They were never confused about the round. The confusion and the damage came from somewhere else entirely. Then the top straps began to burn. On the Ruger Blackhawk, built for the cartridge, owners started reporting a thin groove worn into the steel bridge above the cylinder gap, the top strap, scorched away by hot gas. The forcing cone, the short funnel of steel where the bullet first enters the barrel, showed erosion. Photographs circulated through the gun magazines. Counter-talk turned sour, and it turned fast. Ruger moved quickly. The company had built roughly 7,500 of the revolvers. It halted production, and then went a step further, offering to refund owners who wanted out. A flagship cartridge, barely a year and a half into its life, had become an orphan its own maker would pay money to take back off the shelf. It is worth sitting with how unusual that is. Companies discontinue cartridges all the time, quietly, by simply not making them anymore. They very rarely buy the guns back. That refund was not housekeeping. It was a company trying to make a problem disappear before it had a name. From triumphant launch to quiet retreat, the whole arc took about a year and a half. A cartridge the magazines had greeted as the most powerful production revolver round of its day was, within 18 months, the one thing nobody wanted their name attached to. Few cartridges in American history have risen and fallen so quickly, and fewer still have managed it while working exactly as they were designed to. The verdict traveled faster than any fact ever could. The .357 Maximum, the story went, was a round so violent it devoured the very gun that fired it. It made for a tidy, repeatable headline, the Magnum that ate itself. It was also wrong. Because the cartridge did not cut those top straps, the bullet the ammunition industry chose to load into it did. To see how, go back 20 years before the Maximum, to 1963, and a man named Lee Jurras. Jurras founded a company called SuperMags, and he sold the shooting world a seductive idea: that a lighter bullet, driven far faster, made a better stopper than a heavy, slow one. He was not wrong about everything. His jacketed hollow points were a genuine advance over the soft lead of the day. But the idea did more than catch on. It became a faith. By the late 1960s, departments from the Los Angeles County Sheriff to the Phoenix Police were clamoring for light, screaming fast loads. And the giants, Winchester, Remington, Federal, scrambled to catch up and feed the craze with light, fast offerings of their own. The big makers did not merely compete with Jurras. For a time, they tried to strangle him, even refusing to sell him the brass cases his little company needed, before bending to the demand he had created and flooding the shelves with light, fast loads of their own. By the middle of the 1970s, the lightweight bullet was no longer one option among many. It had become the fashion, the expectation, the thing a serious buyer was simply supposed to want. Now follow the quiet economics, because this is the part that matters. A lighter bullet always posts a bigger velocity number. A bigger velocity number sells a smaller box. Over a single decade, the figure printed on the cardboard, not the performance in flesh or steel, quietly became the thing the customer was actually buying. So picture the moment the .357 Maximum lands on that market in 1983. Here is a cartridge engineered from the ground up around heavy bullets and slow powder, dropped into an industry that had spent 20 years training its own customers to worship light and fast. The factories did the predictable thing. They loaded the Maximum the way the market had been taught to read it: light, loud, and fast, with bullets far lighter than the heavy ones it was designed around. And that was the wound. The mechanism is not complicated. A light bullet leaves the case early and clears the barrel quickly, and that lets a column of superheated, high-pressure gas blow past it, through the cylinder gap and across the top strap, before the bullet has fully sealed the bore. The flame, not the lead, does the cutting. Load the very same cartridge the way Gates designed it: a heavy bullet over a slower powder, and that gas stays trapped behind the bullet, pushing it where its energy belongs. The Maximum never tried to cut itself in half. It was handed a bullet built to a magazine cover's logic, and that bullet did exactly what such a bullet does. The industry manufactured the disease. Then it stood over the patient and read out the diagnosis. The men who actually shot the thing said so out loud, at the time, for anyone willing to listen. John Taffin, a veteran gunwriter who has spent decades behind heavy revolvers and put thousands of rounds through the SuperMags with his own hands, watched it unfold in real time. The Maximum, he wrote, was embraced by the silhouette shooters who understood it at the very same moment it was being trashed by fellow writers who did not. They never grasped what it was for. It was never meant, in his telling, to see how fast a light bullet could be flung from a revolver. It was meant to give Magnum velocity to a heavy one. The men dragging its name through the mud were judging it by the single job it had never once been built to do. He was not alone in the room. David Bradshaw, who tested the cartridge alongside Bill Ruger's own son and wrote it up for the gun press in 1984, documented the same yawning gap between what the round actually did and what the rumor insisted it did. None of this was hidden. It ran in the same magazines that carried the rumors, sometimes only a few pages apart. But a careful correction never travels the way a frightening headline does. The story that a Magnum had devoured itself was simply more thrilling than the truth that a fine cartridge had been fed the wrong bullet. And thrilling is what gets remembered. And here is the line the obituary left out entirely. Fired the way it was designed, the flame cutting was not even fatal. On revolvers run with proper heavy loads, the erosion typically slowed and stopped after the first 1,000 rounds or so, and then simply never advanced. No worse than the honest flame cutting seen on countless hard-used Magnums that nobody ever called death traps. The proof is in who kept faith with it. Dan Wesson, whose revolvers were built around an interchangeable barrel system on a heavy frame, kept chambering the cartridge for years, and their guns went on placing high in silhouette competition long after Ruger had walked away. The Thompson Center single shot carried it longer still. The cartridge worked. It kept working. It just worked for the people who never believed the rumor in the first place. The .357 Maximum was not a cartridge that failed. It was a cartridge that was framed. So why did its own maker let it die? For the same reason most good things die in this business. It was cheaper. Bill Ruger scrapped the entire line. The reasons that survive in the record are the ones that always survive: worry over liability, and pressure from a handful of loud, ill-informed writers who had already decided the cartridge was dangerous. Standing against that current would have cost money and time, and a willingness to pick a public fight with the market about the very light bullet fashion the entire industry was busy getting rich on. Killing the cartridge, by contrast, took a press release and a stack of refund checks. Do the arithmetic the way a balance sheet does. 7,500 revolvers is a rounding error to a company that size. Quietly buying them back and clearing the catalog cost less, far less, than standing up in public and saying the genuinely uncomfortable thing in plain words: that the cartridge was sound, and that the ammunition the industry itself had built for it was the actual problem. To say that out loud was to admit that the light bullet gospel carried a hidden bill. It would have indicted not one orphan round, but a decade of marketing and a warehouse full of product. It was simpler and cheaper and quieter to let the orphan take the blame for all of it. And someone always pays for that kind of quiet. The shooter who wanted a heavy bullet hunting revolver lost a genuinely great one. The handful of owners who kept their Blackhawks were left holding a gun the press had branded defective. And the truth itself, that the cartridge had never been the problem, was buried beneath a decade of marketing that found it far more convenient to forget. Remington wound the ammunition down by the late 1980s. The round that had beaten every Magnum its size went into the ground with a headstone that blamed the victim, while the bullet that actually did the cutting stayed right there on the shelf, selling. But a good design does not really die. It just changes its name and waits. The stretched frame that Ruger and Dan Wesson built to hold the .357 Maximum did not vanish with the cartridge. It became the foundation for an entire family of larger rounds: the .375, the .414, the .445 SuperMag. Cartridges that drove heavy bullets to genuine rifle energy out of a revolver, exactly as Elgin Gates had drawn it up on the bench years before. And the people who knew the truth never stopped. The silhouette shooters kept loading them. The single-shot crowd kept loading them. And every last one of them did it the same disciplined way that Gates had insisted on from the start. Heavy bullet, slow powder, no shortcuts, no chasing the number on the box. There is a quiet justice in that. The SuperMag rounds that followed are prized pieces today, chambered in some of the rarest and most coveted revolvers ever assembled, and not one of them would exist without the orphan the industry had been so eager to forget. The cartridge outlived its own obituary by quietly becoming the thing everything heavier was built upon. So the cartridge the catalogs wrote off as a failure quietly became the skeleton holding up some of the most powerful production revolvers ever built. Its name was erased from the price lists. Its bones are still everywhere a heavy bullet leaves a long cylinder. Look again at that stretched brass case, 3/10 of an inch longer than the Magnum it grew out of. It was not buried because it was bad. It was buried because it was honest in a market that had fallen in love with the wrong number. It asked for a heavy bullet and a patient hand at the exact moment the whole industry was selling light, loud, and fast. It did the harder, truer thing. And the harder, truer thing rarely wins the catalog page. It almost never does. I have spent more years than I care to admit reaching for the heavier bullet and the slower powder, while the fashionable answer sat right there on the shelf, cheaper and louder and easier. And not once have I felt cheated for standing with the people who still do it that way. If that is the tradition you come from, if you would rather have the truth than the headline, then you already belong here. Subscribe and stand with the ones who still tell it straight.